Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Before we go around the room and say our names, it's our tradition. Is there anyone joining us today for the first time or returning after a while? Okay, I didn't think so, but I wanted to make sure. I'll go ahead and begin if I may. My name is Roy.
I'm Tom. Vin. I'm Grant.
I'm Michael.
I'm Rick.
Scott. Max.
Francesco.
Tom.
Jim.
Larry. I'm Oswaldo.
I'm Jeff.
Matthew.
Rob.
I'm David.
I'm Jack.
My name is Cass.
Tony.
Dennis.
Peter.
David.
Tip.
Grisha.
John. Juan.
I'm Richard.
My name is Joe. Jay.
Mike.
And
David.
David Lewis. David Lewis has been following the Dharma path for over 40 years and has a degree in comparative religious studies. He started out in the Tibetan Shambhala tradition and has been practicing Vipassana meditation since moving to San Francisco 30 years ago. David is a member of the Mission Dharma Sangha, where he teaches an introduction to insight meditation class. He's a longtime member of the Gay Buddhist Fellowship and also leads a weekly sitting group for seniors every Friday morning. David is currently enrolled in the Spirit Rock Meditation Center's Advanced Practitioners Program and has been on the teaching team for Spirit Rock retreats. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Good morning. Happy Buddha's birthday. It was yesterday.
Is he in Aries or what is he?
Well, it's a rather fluid date. In different traditions, it's different dates, and generally it happens in April or May. But in the Mahayana tradition, it was yesterday. I heard they had a parade at the Zen Center.
Cool.
In some countries, some other traditions, in some countries it happens later. And it's the holiday is called Vesak, and it's not just Buddha's birthday, because I don't think anybody really knows what Buddha's birthday was, but it's also commemorates his enlightenment and any other big events in his life. But in any case, it's the Buddhist spring event, and it's one of the biggest holidays on the Buddhist calendar. So, happy Vesak. So I wanted to, partly because of it's Buddha's birthday, I wanted to talk about something talk about some ideas and practices that were pretty unique to the Buddha. A lot of what we know as Buddhism and study and practice, some of it was borrowed from the Hindu tradition that he was born into. And some of the Buddha's teachings, the more interesting ones, the more compelling ones to me, are the ones that are completely unique to the Buddha. One of which is the study of dependent origination, which I'm not going to talk about today. But another one is the emphasis that he put on mindfulness. The last three factors in the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is the path to awakening that the Buddha outlined. The Eightfold Path is the Fourth Noble Truth. The last three factors of the Eightfold Path all have to do with meditation. They're energy, concentration, and mindfulness. The first factor on the Eightfold Path was right view. And right view is commonly understood or defined as understanding the nature of suffering and the way to alleviate it, which is basically what the Four Noble Truths is all about. We recognize that there's the common problem of humanity is dissatisfaction that we all deal with. I'm sure if you notice during the course of your meditation, you've probably experienced some dissatisfaction. When's the bell going to ring? When can I get up and stretch? So right view is understanding the nature of suffering or of dissatisfaction and the way of alleviating it, and that acknowledges that there is the possibility of alleviation of suffering, which I actually find talking to Western students, sometimes people have a lot of skepticism about. Like, can I really wake up? And what is liberation? And is it for me? This practice is very pragmatic. It's not a belief system. It's something that you do. And what we do is essentially recognize suffering, acknowledge suffering in our own lives, and that might be very mild, something that you might not even call suffering, simply dissatisfaction. I want more of this, less of that, as simple as that. And letting go of that. The third noble truth is letting go. So awakening, I deeply believe awakening is possible in this very life. It's possible for every one of us. The Buddha said, I wouldn't be teaching this if I didn't think you could do it. And people have been doing it for 2,500 years. So I just want to start by acknowledging that awakening is possible. It happens in increments, in my experience, and for people that don't know, that haven't practiced long or don't know a lot about Buddhism, when we talk about awakening, they think of nirvana. They think, well, I'm never going to get there, or I haven't started yet, or that's a goal. I've never met anybody that is enlightened. But awakening is actually a spectrum, and happens in increments. Some of you may have had an awakening moment in your meditation this morning, and that's simply a moment when you were free of greed, aversion, and delusion. And you're simply fully present in the present moment without getting in the way. So that's right view. It's something we know, and it's also something that we practice. So how do we know? That's the next thing I wanted to talk about. How do we know anything? How do we know this? How do we know anything? The Buddha taught that there's 3 different ways of knowing. Study, which includes listening to teachers, listening to Dharma talks, reading. The second way of knowing is contemplation, thinking about anything that crosses your mind or anything that you've studied or anything that you've learned. And the third way of knowing is meditation or mindfulness, which takes knowing to a whole different level. And this is one of the things that's pretty unique to the Buddha. Not so much the practice of meditation. People certainly meditated before the Buddha's time. But to the best of my knowledge, no one had ever put so much emphasis on mindfulness as a way of experiencing reality, a way of knowing the nature of things, which includes the nature of mind. So bhavana, that's the Pali word for meditation. Bhavana, or meditation, comprises the last of those 3 ways of knowing, and it's not optional. Not optional on the path, if you want to awaken. The path is certainly optional. As the Buddha taught in his famous sutta to the Klamas, he basically said, this is what I have to offer, take it or leave it. It's up to you. If it's not a good fit for you, find another teacher or find another path. But the Buddha's offering was the Eightfold Path, and you can't do any one part of the Eightfold Path, or it's not skillful to try to focus on one part of the Eightfold Path and ignore everything else. Because, for instance, if you don't practice virtue, if you have a lot of guilt, or you're harming yourself and you're harming other people, that'll make meditation very difficult. And likewise, if you don't meditate, it'll make wisdom harder to come by. So the Eightfold Path is a package. Every one of the factors feeds on all of the others. And it circles around on itself. So I'm going to be talking mostly about the last three factors on the Eightfold Path, which, as I said before, relate to meditation. And this is all about direct experience, which is different than cognitive thinking. And most of the learning that we do in the West, and the way all of us were trained through our academic careers and in life in general, is by cognitively understanding something, thinking about things, deciding, making judgments. Direct experience is quite a different way of learning. It's noticing what's arising in the present moment without judging, simply accepting. So there's a Zen expression about the difference between studying or listening to a teacher talk and direct experience, and that's that listening to a teacher, listening to a talk like what I'm doing right now, is like watching a finger that's pointing at the moon, as opposed to looking at the moon itself. So there's a drawback to putting too much emphasis on teachers and study. We might be spending too much time looking at the finger. Cognitive understanding has been compared to constantly perusing the menu without ever tasting the food, looking at the finger instead of looking at the moon. It's not mystical. It's simply witnessing things as they are. Things as they are is the definition of dharma, or nature. There's a Burmese teacher that I'm fond of right now named Utejaniya, and he doesn't talk about dharma much. He talks about nature. That's his definition of dharma. So, by this understanding, anyone can meditate. Meditation is simply noticing what arises in the moment, non-judgmentally. If you're judgmental, or if you have an idea of what's supposed to happen when you meditate, then you might get into trouble. You might get into your own way. Meditation might be difficult. And usually when people tell me that they can't meditate, or meditate is really difficult for them, it's usually because they haven't had an idea that something should be happening that's not their direct experience, not what's happening to them in the moment. So the instructions are really a lot easier than they seem to be. Simply pay attention, non-judgmentally, to what's arising in the moment. That's all there is to it. Whether we do it after the bell rings, or before the bell rings, or during lunch. It's a quote from Adyashanti. The process of finding the truth may not be a process by which we feel increasingly better and better. It may be a process by which we look at things honestly, sincerely, truthfully, and that may or may not be an easy thing to do. So when we're honest with our experience, especially when we see our own dissatisfaction arising, it may be uncomfortable. Another quote about that from Henepola Guanaratana, the monastic. You might have heard this before, it's a good one. Somewhere in this process, you will come face to face with the sudden and shocking realization that you're completely crazy. Your mind is a shrieking, gibbering madhouse on wheels barreling pell-mell down the hill, utterly out of control and hopeless. No problem. You are not crazier than you were yesterday. It's always been this way. You just never noticed. Anybody experienced that in their meditation this morning? So dharma, or the nature of the world, or the nature of mind, all of which are the same thing, can only be experienced through our six senses. There's only 6 ways that we can actually experience the world. Seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, and cognizing.
And what?
Cognizing. So the first 5 of those are the 5 senses that you're familiar with. Most everything that we take in from the world comes in through our five senses. That's how we experience the world. That's how we know things. The Buddha added cognizing to that list. The Buddha said that thinking was the sixth sense. And by thinking, he didn't mean making up stories or having conversations. By thinking, he meant thoughts simply arise. In the same way that we hear a sound from outside the room, and we may or may not know what it is, it's just a sound, it comes to us. In the same way, thoughts arise in our mind. So in meditation's not about preventing thoughts from arising. Pretty hard to do. Thoughts come up. So in that way, the mind is simply another sense organ. It's the sense organ of thoughts arising, which is different than thinking. Thoughts arising are different than thinking. I often describe a thought as being like a bubble that rises up from the depth of the sea. We don't invite it. It rises all by itself, comes to the surface, pops, and disappears. That's it. Thoughts and emotions last for a split second, unless we chase them or feed them or get attached to them. If we get attached, we can make quite a story about it. It could be the story of the rest of our day. So the way we experience the world, the only way we can know the world is through seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, and cognizing. Watching these thoughts arise and pass away. So we're not separate from the world. The world is filtered through our senses. The world is as much our interpretation of what happens to us and what we see, experience through our senses, as something objective out there. Because your objective reality of the world might be different than mine. Do you all know the parable of the blind men and the elephant? It's a very famous parable that actually predates Buddhism. It's not a Buddhist parable. Well, it is a Buddhist parable, but it's also a Hindu parable and a Jain parable, and it's used in many different traditions. It's ancient. The story is that there's a group of blind men, 4 or 5 blind men, and they are presented with an elephant. And each one of them stands in a different spot around the elephant and reaches out and touches the elephant, not knowing that it's an elephant, and reports on what it is they're touching. So the blind man that is up against the side of the elephant puts his hand there and says, well, that's a wall. And the blind man that's standing next to a leg says, well, that's a tree, obviously. And the blind man by the tail says, well, it's a rope. And the blind man by the ear says it's a great palm frond. So objective reality that shines a light on the difference between our subjective experience and objective reality. It's not always what we think it is. So we only experience the world through our 5 senses plus the mind. And that's a really fundamental teaching of the Buddha, and something that's pretty unique to the Buddha. One of my favorite suttas, so suttas are the teachings of the Buddha, is the story of Bahia, which I might have told here before because I like it so much, but I think it's fundamental. Bahia was a very learned man that lived in the Buddha's time, and I believe had his own followers, had his own spiritual practice, was very knowledgeable. But he thought something was missing, and he heard stories of the Buddha. He said, well, there's this fellow that I've been hearing about that people report knows the answer to the nature of the world, nature of reality, nature of mind. I'm going to go find him. So Bahia set off on this long expedition by himself, walking across India, and eventually found the Buddha. And I'm greatly compressing a very long story, but he asked the Buddha to teach him what he had to teach. He says, please teach me that which is unique to your teaching. Teach me what will allow me to wake up. And the Buddha actually put him off 3 times. But eventually Bahiya insisted, and the Buddha said this. This is the Buddha's answer to Bahiya when Bahiya asked what the core teaching of Buddhism was. The Buddha said, herein, Bahiya, you should train yourself thus. So he's telling him to train himself. He's not saying this is a belief. This is a training. You should train yourself thus. In the seen will be merely what is seen. In the heard will be merely what is heard. In the sensed will be merely what is sensed. In the cognized will be merely what is cognized. This is the way you should train yourself, Bahiya. This is how we meditate. When, Bahiya, for in you the seen is merely the seen, the cognized is merely the cognized, then, Bahiya, you will not be with that. You will not be caught up in thoughts. When, Bahiya, you are not with that, then, Bahiya, you will not be in that. You will not be personalized. And when, Bahiya, you are not in that, then, Bahiya, you will be neither here nor beyond, nor in between the two. Just this is the end of suffering. So the end of suffering is a practice, and the practice is through our 6 senses, as the Buddha described. That's from the Udana teachings. So intuitive understanding, this mindfulness, act of meditation, intuitive understanding, combined with study and contemplation, show us the nature of reality. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with study and contemplation, but they all work together. So what do we experience in meditation? How do we experience the nature of reality? If it's not a story, if it's not a belief, if it's not a dogma, what do we experience? And what's the nature of reality? Good question. The Buddha said that there's 3 characteristics of existence: anicca, dukkha, and anatta. Anicca is impermanence. Dukkha is dissatisfaction, I've already talked about, suffering. And anatta is not self, the principle of non-self. These are the things, the 3 characteristics of existence are the things that are best understood through meditation, through contemplation, through direct experience. They can be understood cognitively to a certain extent. But if you really want to grok it, if you really want to internalize these truths of the nature of existence, it's best to do it through direct experience, using your 6 senses. Anicca vata sankhara is one expression in the Pali language that many Westerners know. And the reason many Westerners know it is because in a lot of both the Theravada and the Mahayana tradition, it's the beginning of a very famous chant that some monastics do every day. The first line of the chant is Anicca vata sankhara, which is translated, all conditioned things are impermanent. Core truth. It's something that you can notice in your direct experience. The rest of the chant translation, or at least the first paragraph of it, is all conditioned things are impermanent. Their nature is to arise and pass away. To live in harmony with this truth brings the highest happiness. So simply noticing the impermanent nature of all things is the road to happiness, according to the Buddha. And by all things, I mean everything that comes to you through all of your senses, from seeing, hearing, feeling, to thinking. They're all impermanent. They're all conditioned. All phenomena that we experience in life and in meditation are conditioned and therefore impermanent. everything changes, everything passes away. The only thing that's permanent is nirvana, is the final awakening. It's one thing that's not conditioned. Everything else is conditioned. So it's a really interesting exploration to do, especially in your meditation, is to, when you're meditating, sit back and notice what's happening in your experience. And instead of getting caught up with the content of what's happening in your experience, bodily sensations, thoughts, stories coming up in the mind, sounds that we hear, instead of getting caught up in the content, we simply notice the changing nature of our experience when we're meditating. And you may have noticed, if you were paying attention when you meditated, that it was like a freight train going by. Bodily sensation, thought, feeling, sound happening, door opening outside, another bodily sensation, 4 more thoughts. It's a series of changing phenomena. So it's a great way to practice, is to not get caught up in the content of what's happening when you're meditating, but simply noticing its changing nature. Everything changes. So that's anicca, that's impermanence, in a nutshell. I could give a whole talk about that. The second characteristic of existence that the Buddha talked about that's universal is dukkha. Dukkha is the first noble truth. Dukkha is a core principle in Buddhism. And dukkha doesn't mean that that life is awful, as it sometimes gets translated by non-Buddhists. This emphasis on dukkha is that life is horrible. It's simply that dukkha simply means that we spend an awful lot of our time, the vast majority of our time, both in meditation and in everyday life, wanting things to be other than they are. We're never quite happy with the present moment, with the way things are. We want more of the good stuff, less of the bad stuff. So if we're restless during meditation, we want that to go away. We want to be tranquil. If we are tired, we want to wake up. So that's dukkha. Simple as that. It's wanting things to be other than they are. Wanting more of this, less of that. If you pay attention to your experience during meditation and eventually in everyday life, if you're mindful of your experience, you'll see all this pushing and pulling that you do. It's exhausting. Always wanting things to be other than they are. Ajahn Chah, who was a great mid-20th century Thai meditation teacher, master, said there are 2 kinds of suffering. There's the suffering you run away from, which follows you everywhere. And there's the suffering that you face directly. And in doing so, you become free. So that's why dukkha, or suffering, or dissatisfaction, is highlighted so prominently by Buddha and everybody that came afterwards. Because Buddha said, in order to alleviate your suffering, you have to stop turning away from it. You have to turn toward it. The way to freedom is going through dissatisfaction rather than turning away from it. And this is a real challenge because most of us have spent most of our lives turning away from suffering. It's just what we do automatically. It's the way we've trained ourselves. That's conditioning, more conditioning. But Ajahn Chah said there's the suffering you turn away from, which will always be with you, and the suffering that you face directly, and in doing so become free. So that's another fundamental meditation or mindfulness instruction is don't turn away from whatever's uncomfortable. Just let it be. Notice its characteristics. Because it's impermanent, like all other conditioned things, it'll dissolve eventually. And you'll notice this in your own experience. It'll go away. But even wanting it to go away is dukkha. So we learn how to be tolerant with discomfort. We learn to notice our own suffering, whether it's big suffering or little suffering. Maybe we just want to get up and stretch. We just, okay, I want to get up and stretch. That's the way it is right now. Let that be. So that's dukkha in a nutshell. The second characteristic of existence, of all things. The third characteristic is anatta, or non-self. And it's the one that's maybe hardest to understand for us Westerners. But it's the idea that nothing is inherently me or mine in my experience, which is just the opposite of the way we behave in the world. We tend to take things on. My opinions are mine alone. My perception of the elephant is mine. I mean, I know that elephant. I know that thing is a rope because I'm holding on to the end. That's my opinion. Might not be right. If I didn't have such a high opinion of myself, I might be open to that elephant being something else. Here's a quote about, roughly, about anatta that I like. A human being is a part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feeling as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. That is from the great Dharma master, Albert Einstein. A human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feeling as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons, only a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. It's a profoundly Buddhist statement. We are part of everything else. We're not separated. And the idea, the belief that we are separated, that we're special, is a delusion. It's exactly what the Buddha said. It's a delusion. We're not separated. So that's the third characteristic of existence, is anatta, that we're not separated. Anatta means we're not separated. So that might sound, all of that, the three characteristics of existence, the way I'm talking about it, might sound like a metaphysical proposal or metaphysical concept or some existential idea. But the Buddha said it's part of our direct experience, and that understanding the three characteristics of existence through our direct experience is the way to freedom, the way to awaken, the way to liberation, the way to happiness. So how does that work with the three characteristics? How does anatta free us? Or Nietzsche, for that matter. In terms of Nietzsche, impermanence. This is my explanation. When we truly absorb the universal truth of Nietzsche, of impermanence, when we truly absorb it, understand it through direct experience, we will no longer fear death, change, or loss. We'll be free of fear of death when you realize how natural death is. It's just change. It's a Nietzsche. As for dukkha, when we see the dukkha inherited in our experience, the dukkha inherent in our sense desires and addictions, including thinking. Thinking is an addiction, can be an addiction. Usually is an addiction. When we see the dukkha inherent in our sense desires and addictions, they lose their enchantment. We let go. We let go of those addictions because they don't enchant us anymore. Because we see the suffering that's inherent. And as for anatta, when you understand interconnectedness, this is actually a quote, when you understand interconnectedness, it makes you more afraid of hating than dying. That was said by Robert Thurman, who is a great contemporary American Buddhist teacher and Uma's dad. When you understand interconnectedness, it makes you more afraid of hating than dying. So, suffering and awakening are not at odds with each other. Suffering and awakening, I like to say, are part of the same weather system. There's no awakening without understanding suffering and impermanence and not self. In fact, part of our problem with suffering, the reason we resist it and turn away from it, is because it arises from impermanence. The fact that our lives are always changing, our world's always changing, our reality is changing, these bodies get old and diseased and eventually die, and people come into our lives and leave our lives, all that change. Our response to that is usually dukkha. So suffering and awakening are not at odds with each other. They're part of the same weather system. I want a little time to talk, but I'd like to close with a quote that I think I've used it before, but it's worth repeating. Has a lot to do with impermanence, but I think it kind of covers all of the three characteristics. This is from Jeff Foster, who's a British Buddhist teacher. You will lose everything. Your money, your power, your fame, your success, perhaps even your memories. Your looks will go. Loved ones will die. Your body will fall apart. Everything that seems permanent and impermanent will be smashed. Experience will gradually, or not so gradually, strip away everything that it can strip away. Waking up means facing this reality with open eyes and no longer turning away. But right now, we stand on sacred and holy ground, for that which will be lost has not yet been lost. And realizing this is the key to unspeakable joy. Whoever or whatever is in your life right now has not yet been taken away. This may sound trivial. They say it trivial. Obvious, like nothing. But really, it is the key to everything. The why and how and wherefore of existence. Impermanence has already rendered everything and everyone around you so deeply holy and significant and worthy of your heartbreaking gratitude. Loss has already transfigured your life into an altar.
And who's the author of that?
Jeff Foster. Would you like me to repeat it?
Yes.
Yes, please.
You will lose everything. Your money, your power, your fame, your success, perhaps even your memories. Your looks will go. Loved ones will die. Your body will fall apart. Everything that seems permanent is impermanent and will be smashed. Experience will gradually, or not so gradually, strip away everything that it can strip away. Waking up means facing this reality with open eyes and no longer turning away. But right now, we stand on sacred and holy ground. For that which will be lost has not yet been lost. In realizing this is the key to unspeakable joy. Whoever and whatever is in your life right now has not yet been taken away from you. This may sound trivial, obvious, like nothing. but really it is the key to everything, the why and how and wherefore of existence. Impermanence has already rendered everything and everyone around you so deeply holy and significant and worthy of your heartbreaking gratitude. Loss has already transfigured your life into an altar. So that's how, it's a beautiful expression of how suffering becomes joy through this practice. And I probably haven't done a very good job of expressing it, certainly not as well as Jeff Foster does, but I did my best. So thank you for your kind attention. And I'm open to any questions or comments or your thoughts on any of the above. David, please.
This is more of a general question when you were talking about paths. How do you come to the decision what path is right for you? Obviously, even the paths you consider are part of your family and your culture and what even could come to mind to even try. And there's paths we don't even know about and even think about. So how is that determined? What's been your journey? And how do you know whether a path is working or beneficial? If you were to talk to it about a Christian or a Hindu or somebody who's a bunch of different paths, they would probably say in some level that it's working.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, good question. That's exactly the question that the Buddha was asked when he visited the village of the Kalamas. The Kalamas were a group of people. And the answer he gave, the sutta, the teaching that he gave to the people at the Kalamas was the Buddha's famous discourse. We call it the Discourse on Free Inquiry. And the people of the village, the Buddha walked into the village, and the people of the village said, "Well, some other guy was just here yesterday, and there was, another group that were here last week, and everything they said was contradictory." And they kind of rolled their eyes when the Buddha showed up, and said, "Why should we believe you?" And the Buddha's answer was this. Come, Kalamas, do not go upon what has been acquired by repeated hearing, nor upon tradition, nor upon rumor, nor upon what is scripture, nor upon surmise, nor upon axiom, nor upon specious reasoning, nor upon bias towards a notion that has been pondered over, nor upon another seeming ability, nor upon consideration. It's all the two ways of learning, first two ways of learning. Nor upon, quote, the monk is our teacher. Don't trust your teachers. Kalamas, when you yourselves know these things are good, these things are not blamable, these things are praised by the wise, undertaken and observed, these things lead to benefit and happiness, then enter and abide on them. So the Buddha is saying, trust your own intuition. And for me, what that's meant in my spiritual life, and I've been spiritually interested since I was a teenager, interested in various spiritual systems. What that's meant to me was a certain amount of shopping around different traditions until I found one that resonated with me, intuitively, that resonated with me. I don't think there's any one right tradition, personally. It depends on what resonates with you and what works. And then when you find something that kind of resonates, then you step into that tradition and give it a try. You check it out. You check out your direct experience. Like everything else that I was talking about this morning is, how does this feel, my direct experience? Does this seem to be true? Do I find relief from suffering by understanding my suffering? Does that work? And if it does, then you build faith, what we call faith. And faith isn't, in Buddhism anyway, faith isn't blind faith. Faith is a trust that this works. And the more we practice, the more we either build trust or we find some doubt and think, well, maybe this isn't for me, and we go looking someplace else. So many people eventually land in a tradition, and most religious traditions, whether Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu, have suggestions, as the Buddha did, about how you go about practicing. Most people land in a tradition that resonates with them, and they try it out. Some people spend their entire life perusing the menu, their entire life shopping around. But it just kind of depends on you. And it's an intuitive thing. Does that help? Does that help? Paul?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I like that question too, because I've done my share of shopping around, and what's come up for me is that some of these teachers call it the big question, your big question, right? So what I've discovered is that just sitting with the question, somehow the question gets resolved somehow. My big question were things like, why am I a loser? Why can't I do anything professionally or something like that? And just the more, the question just becomes absurd at some point, because it's not really what it's about. It's more the things that learning. Hey, yeah, this is what my mind is doing. This is what I'm doing to myself. It's more like I don't have to see life this way. And I can get peace by meditating in this way. And wow, everything kind of works out. So my big question is, so it's not really about what I think it's about. I guess, like Dogen, his big question was, well, why do I have to sit to become a Buddha,
Yeah.
And he resolved that.
Yeah. You don't have to. You can do it standing up. But I love that. That's a beautiful example. I love the way you said, why do I do this to myself? I mean, that's the point at which you're recognizing your own suffering, how you create your own suffering. And when you recognize that, when I recognize that, why do I do this to myself? Why am I doing myself? Why am I so self-judgmental? Then I can sometimes let go of it, because I just realize it's something that I do to myself. So that's a beautiful way of thank you for that, for expressing it. Why do we do this to ourselves? It's a question we don't ask very often. Do you have something?
Is there, do you have a sense of the sensation of awareness, of mindfulness, in the presence, or is there some things that you, by some means, that you sense that you were there? Do you know what I mean?
I think I know what you're talking about, and that's a really interesting exploration for me. I think you're talking about mindfulness as, correct me if I'm wrong, mindfulness is a way of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying, can we know that we're knowing?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. We can know that we're knowing, and it has been speculated by neuroscientists as well as spiritual practitioners that this is what makes us uniquely human. Human beings as a species are called Homo sapiens sapiens. Not Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens sapiens. Men who know their knowing.
Who knows?
Who knows?
Yeah.
I'm sorry you answered that question. Can the next week's teacher answer that one? No, that's a great question. That's the anatta question, right? Who knows?
Yeah.
Who is it that knows? And I can only present that as maybe that was your intention. I only present that as a koan. to reflect on. Because there's not an actual, I mean, I don't have an answer to that. Who knows? Except maybe in my tradition, in my practice, it's the wrong question. The answer is knowing happens. Knowing happens. There's no who. Knowing arises in the same way that a sound arises or a bodily sensation arises. But yeah, I would say knowing happens. But it's a really wonderful, to the best of my knowledge, most different Buddhist traditions, that is a favorite question of teachers to get students to reflect on anatta. So take that one home with you. Courtesy of Jeff. Who knows?
Jeff knows. Okay. But this is my old struggle with Buddhist, this anatta. So we're all connected. You know, we're all a little dot in an infinity of a networked dimension. But can't that little nothing dot have some identity?
Well, sure, we do have an identity. In fact, we need an identity to get by in the world, to do our jobs and to have relationships, and it's a functional thing, having an identity. But from a Buddhist perspective, it's a useful delusion. Having an identity, it's a useful delusion. It helps us get by in the world, but it's not the ultimate truth of the nature of our existence. Identity. Identity is something we take on. Identities, our race, our sexual orientation, our education, our culture.
I mean, none of those attributes do I mean in terms of identity.
Okay.
As a point of will, choosing to be aware, trying to be aware. That suggests more than just an aggregate of characteristics to me.
I think that's the same I think you're asking the same question that Jeff did.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? Who's aware? What's the identity?
Mm-hmm.
What's aware?
And is it the same awareness?
And is it the same awareness as with everyone? Yeah. I gave a talk, and I don't have time to go into it today. I gave a talk about consciousness a couple of weeks ago. And there was actually a wonderful article in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago from a philosopher who studies consciousness, which I can't remember his name. But philosophers and scientists and neuroscientists have not quite solved the problem of consciousness. When Oliver Sacks died, before Oliver Sacks died, he said, this is the great question that has not yet been answered.
Dennett.
Sorry?
Dennett. Someone.
That might be right,
Yeah.
Dennett, the philosopher. Yeah. So Oliver Sacks said consciousness is the great discovery that hasn't been made yet, but it's going to be made very soon by somebody. It might be a philosopher, it might be a neuroscientist. But there is, and this really fascinates me, there is, I don't know if I believe it, there is a belief among some people that consciousness is universal. What you're suggesting, and that consciousness is in the universe, in every tree, animal, rock. Consciousness is everywhere.
So announcements. Let's see, Carl isn't here today, but there is an LGBT weekly meditation group that now meets here on Mondays. So if you'd like to further your path and come and meditate from 5:30 to 6:30. And I understand they do a half-hour meditation and a half-hour dharma talk. So they're now going to be here on Monday nights. And Donna is the Pali word for giving. Our host will pass the Donna Bowl today. The suggested donation is $10, but whatever you can spare, you can give. It's always greatly appreciated to meet all of our costs for our rent, our newsletter, our speakers, the Larkin Street dinners, our mailers. So he'll be out there during the social hour, and then other announcements.
Next week, drum roll, is our very own facilitator, Roy King. He's going to talk about courage and compassion, a journey. Born and raised in San Francisco and a 10-year member of GPF, Roy King has been on a journey of self-discovery brought on by experiences of loss and grief. From March 2006 through September 2012, he lived with the deaths of 6 wonderful friends and family, including his beloved mother, Victoria. Directly involved in the care and dying processes of these loved ones. Roy learned many important lessons that have shaped his life today and would like to share how those lessons have brought him closer to his inner truth.
Thank you. Next week, huh?
Start practicing.
When you mentioned, can the teacher next week do that? I was like, Okay, so our host.
I am your host, and there is a sign-up sheet. Since there's no new people here, probably we don't have to worry about that today. But there is a sign-up sheet. There is tea, hot water for tea, and you can just put your cups in the sink, and I will take care of them. There's treats on the table, and I just want you to know there's 6 chocolate covered cookies out there that will probably go. So, we do meet at the door after the social hour, people that want to go to lunch together. So that's something to keep in mind. And I'll be bringing the Dawn Bowl.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, let's go ahead and stand for the dedication. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow, and may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.